I'm Heath Lambert, and I want to thank you for listening to the second week of What Happened at First Baptist. At the end of every week, I'm going to give you an opportunity to submit your questions and give me the privilege of answering those questions that you submit. If you have questions that you want to ask about this week's episode or last week's episode or weeks that you hear about in the future, you can submit those questions to the email address whathappened@fbcjax.com. This week, as every week, I'm here with Spencer Harmon. Spencer Harmon is a great, faithful minister of the gospel here at First Baptist. He is the campus pastor of our Nocatee campus. He's a great friend. He was here through many of the years of transition at First Baptist, and he is the one who is receiving your questions and presenting them to me. So, Spencer, it's good that you're here with us this week.
It's great to be here, and really good to listen to week two's episodes, both in the main podcast, the story podcast, and the leadership. So I want to start here, and I think a lot of our folks who listened to the main episode will remember that you used this picture of Criswell, Vines, Lindsay standing on the auditorium, and you said it arrested you. Mm-hmm. And you used that as this kind of picture of how decline can happen even when we don't see it happening. So questions have come in, and even a question that I have, even as I listened to the episode this week, is, okay, decline, First Baptist was already 3 years into decline, 4 years into decline when that photo was taken. Is it even possible to see decline from their seat at that point? Like, how do you identify decline? How would they have identified that decline? What would the signs have been back then for them to say, oh man, we have peaked and now we're going down? Mm-hmm. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so the way I know it is because I've looked at attendance reports. So they were making very detailed attendance reports back then. And so the attendance reports that I have seen today are the attendance reports that they would have had back then. So that's how we know decline had started. There is somebody that I interviewed who was very much involved at First Baptist back in the glory days. And he tells stories of being up in the baptistry, looking around the corner during the preaching and counting. And he was able to identify that numbers were going down. So the way you know is by measuring, by counting. But, it's not, so that's how we know. The question is, was there anything to do? So a couple things about that. First of all, one of the points that I tried to make this week is your church is going to decline. Mm-hmm. It's going to happen. Like, there is no church that's on an unstoppable trajectory. So sooner or later, on our watch, on somebody who follows us, on their watch, our church is going to decline. First Baptist was going to decline. You can't baptize 1,000 people a year every year from now until Jesus comes back. That's just not going to be what happens. One amazing thing about Dr. Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay watched these numbers like a hawk. There's a fascinating story that people talk about around here where there was one Sunday, I don't know what year it was, but there was one Sunday when he preached the gospel and nobody came forward. And it flattened him. He'd not seen this before. He couldn't believe that the gospel was preached and people did not come forward and believe and get baptized at First Baptist Church. And what he did, he called an emergency deacon meeting. And he prevailed on these lay leaders in the church to pray. He prevailed on these leaders in the church to get busy sharing the gospel, to get busy inviting unbelievers to church. And then there was a rebound and people began responding again. Wow. So that's the kind of leader Lindsay was. He was watching the numbers. It mattered to him that people were turning from their sin and trusting in Jesus. And when they didn't, he pulled the alarm. I think what you have in the late 90s is Dr. Lindsay was not well. He was in very, very poor health. He managed to live by God's grace until the year 2000. But in the late 90s, when the decline started, we're talking small decline. We're not talking about the precipitous decline that would later ensue. But he would have known it But I think that he was just in bad health. And then here's the deal. In 2000, when he died, I really do think that the blessing that was on First Baptist in those tremendous years of growth was in many ways the same as the blessing that was on Lindsay's life. I think the Lord blessed First Baptist Church through Homer Lindsay. I think he blessed Homer Lindsay through First Baptist Church. I don't know. I wouldn't know how to untangle those two things. And I think when Dr. Lindsay died, I think that was the end of whatever the Lord had been doing. I'm not saying the Lord wasn't going to do anything else. I'm not saying he didn't do anything else, but that incredible thing, the end of it came with his death, and that's when the decline was instituted. And I just think that was of the Lord.
Yeah. Okay. So that actually gets into what I would say is the flavor of this episode 2. We called it Ruin. And so you're chronicling the decline of First Baptist. One of the things that was the hardest thing for me to listen to, and I think our listeners to listen to this week, is just this sadness that you hear over a recognition that, man, we're not growing like we once were. But there was this other dynamic that I noticed this week that I want to ask you about. So what I would call it is that there was this nostalgic grief. There's in this episode this week, there's people weeping over pews being lost, even though they know that, I know it's not about pews, but these buildings and these pews and these things that we had that are now gone, these old things. I want to talk about that. Is it wrong to have nostalgia over things in the church like pews and buildings and pulpits and rooms? And what would you say even to church members today at First Baptist that still grieve the loss of like the old things? What would you say to them?
I would say in many ways that's the way it's supposed to work.
Okay.
What happened here was wonderful. What happened here at this church was unparalleled. Listen, I'm telling you, there have been seasons of revival in this country that we call great awakenings, that saw less people come to faith in Jesus than what happened at First Baptist Church in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s. It was a marvelous, spectacular thing. And when those things happen, you're supposed to love it. You're supposed to love it when your friends and neighbors get saved. You're supposed to love it when your kids and grandkids get saved. You're supposed to love it when you and your spouse and your kids are called into ministry and you're sent overseas. I mean, you're supposed to celebrate those things. Quite frankly, one of the main purposes of this podcast is to celebrate the remarkable work of God at this remarkable place through a remarkable number of people. It is right to celebrate those things, and it is right to mourn over their loss. What we need to be careful, and this is another huge, important reality behind this podcast, is we don't want ever to let our love, appreciation, respect, and even grief over good things that have happened that are now gone. We don't want that to imperil our present and future ministry. So what I would say is love the good things that happened. Thank the Lord for them. Even mourn over their loss, but always, always remember that ministry from where we stand is always going to have to be more about what's going to happen in the future than what happened in the past. And we should never, ever, ever let our memories of the good things the Lord did in the past overshadow our excitement and anticipation of the wonderful things he's going to do in the future.
So one of the themes that I noticed in the podcast, and you spent some time on this, and even just personally being here for many of these years of transitions, I would say one of the big chapter breaks in the story is the closing down of the main auditorium. That is something that I know a lot of people said, wow, the Lord did so much in my life here. I remember you telling me stories about guest preachers we had here that were looking around at the room and saying, there's so many people that got saved in this room, so much, even church history and the Southern Baptist Convention happened in this room, and it's closed down now. We had some questions come in of people actually talking about the genesis of that building, the beginning of, Dr. Lindsay wants to build a 10,000 person auditorium. You mentioned very briefly in this episode that there were some dissenting voices, and you said, this is a quote, but Dr. Lindsay was the leader, and so his voice won the day. Talk to me about those dissenting voices. There's people that are saying, Dr. Lindsay, we don't think we should do this. I assume those are faithful people saying those things that care about the church. What were those objections? And why did they proceed anyway with the 10,000 person auditorium?
Yeah. So I know some of those dissenting voices. I know them because some of them still go to our church and were involved in advising Dr. Lindsay, involved in that whole process. And they were are very faithful people. It's not like they were smoking cigarettes out on the street and drinking liquor, and then they came in and they said, don't do this good thing. I mean, there were arguments against it. And essentially the arguments against it were, this is too much of a large central building when what we should be doing is branching out. There were concerns that, oh my goodness, if we build this thing, we're going to be spending the rest of its life trying to figure out how to fill it up with people. Because if you build a 10,000 seat room and you have 2,500 people in it, it looks kind of empty. And so there were those kinds of concerns. But I said, as you're reminding us, that Lindsay was the leader and his arguments won the day. I don't mean that to be anything kind of controversial or extreme. I just mean he had a vision for this. He had a plan for this. And as there were conversations happening about it, as there were debates happening about it, his arguments were the ones that won the day. One of the things that I think about when I apply this to myself as a leader is I think it is very, very important for those of us who are leaders to not imagine ourselves as, because we're leaders, we're the ones who get our preferences. We get our way because we're the leader. I think that we are the leader means not I am the keeper of my own personal preferences. That I am the leader means I am the keeper of the argument. And so it is my responsibility as the leader to make the best decision, follow the strongest line of argument that is best for the church, whether I agree with it or not, whether it's my favorite thing or not. So this can be confusing. What I mean is there are all sorts of things that I might like to do. But I have to listen to wisdom, I have to pray, and I have to allow myself to be steered in a different direction if it would really be best for the church. You and I were just in a meeting. The meeting we had before we walked down here to do this. We were in a meeting where there was a group of people essentially arguing that an initiative that I started a couple of years ago at this church, the mood of the room was that it was time for it to go. That had kind of, it had outlived its usefulness and it was time to move on to something else. And as I listened to those arguments, I had to go, you know what? That's right. Now, I could be prissy about the whole thing. I'd be like, what are you guys doing? I'm in charge around here and I've started this and we're going to do it. And if it's not working, it's because of you guys. Well, what I have to do is I have to say, no, okay, what it means that I'm the leader is not that I'm going to enforce my preference, but I'm going to follow the best line of argument. And I'm listening to these people who are saying that that what they think I did a couple of years ago that worked then isn't the best thing to keep doing. And I'm like, all right, let's change. Let's do something different. When the main auditorium was being built, those voices around that room, what everybody wound up thinking was best was that we build that main auditorium, and that's what happened.
Okay, so this actually gets to a listener question that we received on the email this week. And so I just want to read this to you because it's directly related to what you just said. So here's the question. What motivated Dr. Lindsay to build the 10,000 seat auditorium? And they write, of course, we can't see motives, but I'd appreciate your perspective. So what was the argument? What is the motive?
The argument was, honestly, this is going to sound like I'm being flippant. I'm not being flippant. The argument honestly was everything Homer Lindsay touched turned to gold. That's what happened. I mean, that's just the way it was. I mean, when he preached in one service in the Hobson Auditorium, they had to go to two. When they preached in two services in the Hobson Auditorium, they had to go to three. When they built a 3,000-seater, they had to go to two services. They had to put kids on the stairs and break the fire code and do all this kind of thing. And so, my goodness, the hand of God is on this man's ministry. The hand of God is on our church. If everything we build gets filled up, my goodness, trusting the Lord means, I mean, maybe somebody was making an argument, why are we stopping at 10,000? Why don't we make it 15,000 seat? Because every time we do something, God sends all these people. So they built a 10,000 seat auditorium with great faith and confidence in the Lord that he was going to send people to fill it up. And for a time, he really did.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then the decline happens. Right. So, and one of the big lessons, even in the leadership podcast this week, is why do churches decline? Why does this even happen? So, I'm a pastor and I'm listening to this podcast and I'm serving at my church wherever in the country or in the world. And I'm asking this question. Okay, First Baptist declined. You're learning all these lessons from it as the leader here now. How do I stay ahead of decline at my church? I don't want this to happen. I know you said they're all going to decline, but I want to make that as slow of a process as possible. What would you say? How do you stay ahead of this?
That's a great question. And so first of all, I would want to say what you just said, and I don't want to make this a defeatist attitude, but we do have to admit that sooner or later our churches will decline. So you have to know that, but obviously, we want to make sure, insofar as it depends on us, insofar as our stewardship is on the line, we want to stretch out those seasons of growth as long as possible. I think of a couple of things. First of all, the great risk that all of us have in ministry, the great risk is we think that the way we did it is the way we should keep doing it. So this is where I'm making distinctions repeatedly about principles and practices. Like, practices and methodologies change way more often than we feel comfortable with. I think we always have to be asking really, really hard questions about what comes next. What comes next? What do we need to do differently today than we did even maybe yesterday? It is very easy for leaders, for pastors to get comfortable and feel like, hey, I figured out some things. We got a steady revenue stream. Everything's going great guns. There's just no reason to rock the boat. I think we always have to be willing to ask the hard question, what has changed? What is changing? How do we need to make even painful decisions to let go of things that we have loved, that we have cherished, that have been effective to meet the ministry needs of the people who aren't here, to preach Jesus in a bold and fresh way to the people we haven't yet reached. And so I think the great enemy of growth is comfort. And I think if we want to stretch out those seasons of growth as much as we can, we need to always be asking ourselves hard and uncomfortable questions and be willing to make changes even when that just feels really, really, really not good.
One of the most interesting parts of this week, I was listening to the story episode, and you have Pastor Jimmy Scroggins, I know is a good friend of yours, and you interviewed him for this, and he talked about one of the keys and one of the biggest blessings you can give to your successor is flexibilities and facilities and finances. Mm-hmm. I thought that was so interesting, and you could only say that from experience. How are you doing that right now? As you're leading here, this big church, how are you seeking to steward those resources now? Because those resources were the liabilities that had really taken our church to a very difficult place. Every interviewee you talk to talks about facilities and finances. Mm-hmm. How are you seeking to protect those things and to cultivate those things now?
Yeah. So that is the big lesson I learned. Where I was constricted, where our church was constricted, is we just had this albatross around our neck with these big, hulking, broken facilities, and we were just pouring millions of dollars a year into a hole. It wasn't enough. All the millions we were spending, it just wasn't enough. And so the lesson I learned, so I'm going to answer the question out of my perspective, because that's the only perspective I've got. It might not be the same exact answer that somebody else would give. But what I knew we had to do was we had to free up money for ministry by downsizing our facilities. And so what we're doing now, what we have said we're going to do is we are going to be very careful about building projects, because building projects, they lie to you. Building projects are liars. Here's the lie of a building project. Give me $8 million and you'll have your building. Or give me $18 million and you'll have your building. Or $3 million and you'll have your building. That building's lying to you. That's not true. A year after it's built, that building's going to want more of your money. 2 years after that building is built, it's going to want more of your money. It's going to want roofs and air conditioners and carpet. If you don't know how expensive carpet is, you were cheated out of your seminary education, because it is one of the most expensive things that you can get. I've never even seen it. It's so expensive. But so we are very, very careful before we build. Do we really need this? It's better if you can do it to accommodate growth, not with new buildings, but with new services, with additional services. That's the best way to do, because then you're maximizing that facility that you have built. So that's one of the things that we've done, especially downtown, is we've said, hey, when we need to grow again, buildings are the last resort. We're going to accommodate the growth with services. And then the other thing is we watch finances like a hawk. In the budget season, our budget season, we start working on budget about 5 months every year before the church approves it. So honestly, we spend almost half the year working on the budget that we haven't even started yet. And we don't take anything for granted. We ask hard questions. You're a part of this budget process. We ask hard questions of people who are submitting budgets. We look at it. We do not assume that because we spent it last year, we're going to spend it this year. We really work hard to say, hey, are we being as efficient here with this dollar as we could be? And so we just don't take anything for granted. We spend about 5 months out of every year asking really, really hard questions about the budget that our church is going to have for the following year.
That's really helpful. The other part of the podcast that was an indication of a lack of health and decline and ruin was this conversation, this brief clip you had with Pastor Sean about not having your ministry team unified and aligned. And so we had a question come in from a listener, and it was this: how do you keep your ministry team unified today and from having competing visions and philosophies of ministry? How do you do that?
Okay. This is something that we work very, very hard on. Honestly, on a daily basis, we probably work harder on this than on the facilities and the finances, to be candid. So there's a couple things. First thing is we are very, very careful about hiring. Oh my goodness. We do not hire on the basis of spiffy resumes. We do not hire on the basis of grand experience. We might look at your resume very carefully if you have those things, and we might be interested in having a conversation with you. But we always grill our potential hires on their ministry philosophy, on their theological commitments. We spend a tremendous amount of time talking about who we are at First Baptist and what we do at First Baptist. One of the things that I do, you've heard me say this to you when we were talking about you being the campus pastor. I don't ever try to persuade somebody to take a job here. I'm never like, I really hope you'll take it. We really want you. I don't do that. I'm not the Holy Spirit. It's not my job to place a call to ministry in your life. My job is to let you know what the job is. My job might be to let you know why I think you could potentially be a good fit, but I'm not persuading anybody to take a job here. I want you to want the job here. I want you to believe that you can fit in with this team, that you can fit in with our ministry philosophy, with our theological vision of ministry. And so we are very, very careful before we hire. That person has to check a lot of boxes with a lot of people on our team before we say you can join up. Then, after you're on the team, we meet a lot. We spend a lot of time together. One of the things that we talked about this week is how ministries got siloed, and people were on their own. I mean, you would have people working in the same area that wouldn't get together. And then you might have in a really good area, you might have some people who are on the same page, but they'd be talking bad about people in other areas. And it was just very, very destructive of a unified ministry. So we spend a lot of time meeting together. Most of those meetings are serious, where departments are meeting, talking about planning and what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Once a month, we have a staff chapel. There are a number of things that I would never consider missing if I could possibly help it, and one of those things is staff chapel. When we're together for staff chapel, we always talk about mission. We always talk about vision, and I am always trying to talk about that in the most practical ways that I know how, so that everybody's constantly reminded of what we're doing, why we're doing it, who we're doing it with. We also have a lot of fun together. One of the things that I love, because there were so many years here where staff was just in conflict, one of the things that I love are the number of people on our staff who have become best friends with other people on our staff. And so when our pastors get together, when the ministry staff gets together, when the whole staff gets together, it feels more like a family reunion than some sort of horrible burden. So we get together and eat tacos at the beach, and our families get together and have fun. All of that that's not just blowing off time on a Friday night. Those are crucial investments in our ministry partnership. And I think it's all crucial as we think about being a united team.
It really is a blessing, and it's very different. I remember when I first came here, the climate then versus the climate now, and it's night and day, and it's so important. Okay, I got just a couple more questions here before we finish. You talk in the leadership podcast this week about not playing the blame game. In leadership, we often think about the blame game as not being a leader who is blaming your predecessor or blaming the congregation or the people that you lead. And that's really important. But what about when congregations do it? So they might blame leaders or pastors for every bad thing that they see in a church. We've received communication from members of, hey, yeah, there's decline that happened in our church, but our congregation was a part of that decline as well. But it's easy to play the blame game there too. So if you're a member of our church, how do you navigate that? Have you seen this happen where the congregation is playing the blame game with the leaders of the church when there's a shared responsibility with the congregation and, hey, we're a church family in this together, so we all take responsibility for decline? How have you seen this happen, and how would you respond to it?
So, yes, I've seen it all over the place. This doesn't just happen in churches. It doesn't just happen in churches that decline. This is human nature. Just watch. Whenever there is some sort of disaster, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a building collapse, it could be a car accident. Whenever there's something big that makes the national headlines, in the same breath of reporting it, there is going to be who is going to hold the bag on this thing. Even we're in the news right now as we're recording this are these fires in Maui. And there is a great interest, not just, I mean, we still have bodies that are being recovered as you and I are talking about this. And I was listening to a news report this morning that spent more time trying to figure out who is going to be held responsible for this than they were spending trying to figure out who's alive and who's not. I'm not saying that nobody's ever responsible for bad things. I'm just saying there's a human instinct that we want to know who it is. And a lot of times we don't even care if we've got the right one. We just want somebody's head on a platter is what we want. And so that is an instinct. And it's not just human instinct, but then when you get to church, you love your church. You're invested in your church. Your church means the world to you. That it's true at First Baptist. First Baptist has this wonderful, large legacy. It's true of the churches of the leaders who are listening to this. And it's most people feel uncomfortable saying, oh, well, that happened. Let's move on. Most people want to know who's responsible. And maybe not even in a redemptive way. They ask who's responsible while they're putting bullets in their gun, you know? And so I do think we have to be careful with this. You know, one example, you said, do I know any examples? One example where this happened at First Baptist, where you have people who are like, okay, this bad thing happened, and no, we want to know what the bad thing was honestly with the ministry of Rick Stone. Rick Stone was our minister of music here in 1985 to 1990. He served for 5 years, and then he left. And honestly, people from our congregation have been in touch with Rick Stone. And he still to this day gets questions. What bad thing did you do to get the boot at First Baptist? What did you do wrong? What moral thing happened that you were only here for 5 years? And there was nothing. There was nothing. He was here for 5 years and he went to another ministry. He's in ministry now. He is serving faithfully and doing a remarkable thing. And this instinct to play the blame game, to find the dirt, is not only not true, it is not helpful. And so there is an instinct to do it. I think if you're a church member, I'll come to this. I'll say to the leaders, I said, don't blame your successor for all the reasons that I said not to do it. Here I'll say, if you're a church member, take your pastor's lead. Listen, if there is immorality, if there's something really bad that happened and we need to hold somebody to account, sometimes that happens. And if that's the case, then follow your leader into that. But if your leader is saying, hey, you know what, some bad things happen. I know you're trying to place blame right now, but let's move on. This is not important right now. Let's keep this thing moving. I would say follow the lead of your leader.
That's helpful. Okay, let's end here.
Great.
So at the very end of the leadership podcast this week, you had this, I loved this section. You talked about your successor, and you said, my successor right now, if he starts being the pastor at First Baptist when I did, is some guy in the 7th grade right now. Like, his voice is changing as we record this podcast. I want you to think about him. I want you to imagine for a minute that you had the ability to somehow speak to him, okay? What would you tell him that he needs to know about this precious church called First Baptist? What does he need to know about what you've done? What does he need to know that he might need to adjust? What would you just, if you could verbally write a letter to him right now, what are the types of things that you would say to him?
Yeah. So two things about that guy. My little dude, he's actually in the 8th grade now. So when I recorded the podcast, he was in the 7th grade, but he's graduated to the 8th grade now. So he's a big boy now. And if my successor is his age, then he's in the 8th grade. And he would actually, in the Q&A last week, this is the trouble with speaking off the cuff. I said, we've had either 129 or 130 pastors, and that was off by 100. So we've either had 29 or 30 pastors. So that guy who's now in the 8th grade will be either the 30th or the 31st pastor if this goes according to plan. And my little guy walked through. I was hooked up to the IV this morning, taking my IV meds, and he walked by the door and goes, "Hey, Dad." And I was like, there he is. That's my boy. And somewhere, some future pastor is saying, "Hey, Dad," to his son. And so, yeah, what would I say to him? You know, as a leader, people don't sometimes think about this as the responsibility of a leader. But one of the main responsibilities we have as leaders is we are the custodian of our church's story. We're the steward of the story that God has been writing in the churches that we are leading. Honestly, that's one of the main reasons for this podcast. One of the main reasons is I have a responsibility as the pastor of this church to talk about the remarkable history that we've got. Well, there's books that have been written. Some of them are over here on my shelf. One book called A Tale to Be Told about all the remarkable things that the Lord did, and that got us up to the 1990s, and that story needed to be updated. I am responsible to the people who are coming after me to let them know what happened here, what lessons did we learn, what good things is the Lord continuing to do. And so I hope that guy will listen to this podcast. I hope he will learn some of the lessons that I have learned, and then he's going to have new things to figure out, because I'm going to do things that are wrong. I'm going to do things that I intend to go well, but go poorly. And the Lord is going to give him the burden to lead this thing in a new direction. And I prayed for him this morning. I prayed from my heart this morning that when the Lord gives him that responsibility and he stands up to go in a different direction, I'm going to say, let's follow that guy. One story I'll tell about a previous ministry situation was when I was leading the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors, and my predecessor in that organization was a guy named Randy Patton. Great guy, loves the Lord, loves me, loves people. And at the time when I became the leader of the organization, it was called NANC, the National Association of Nouthetic Counselors. And one of the things that I had agreed with the board was that it was time to change the name. NANC, nobody knew what NANC meant. Nobody knew what nouthetic meant. That name had a bad connotation in some people's minds who thought they understood what it meant. And so we all agreed that it was time to change the name. But changing the name of an organization is a big deal that takes a lot of capital. And I talked about this with my predecessor. And I said, I think we need to change the name to ACBC, the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors. And he said, would you let me stand up and speak to that on your behalf? Because he said, he'd been here for, I think he'd been there for 13 years or 15 years at that point. And he said, people are going to be suspicious if they hear it from the new guy. Uh-huh. But if they hear it from the guy who's been here a long time, then they're going to trust it more. And I want to support you in that and do everything I can. And if I could spend some of my capital for you, then that's what I want to do. I have never, he didn't have to do that. He could have been like, good luck, big guy. I've fought all my battles. I'm out of here. I'm not doing anything else. But he did not do that. And I want to remember that example. I can't wait. I pray for the day when I find out that as God is doing a new thing with a new leader in our church into the future, I really want the opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to do everything I can for you. I pray for that day and look forward to it.
Well, thank you for that. Just a reminder to our listeners as we close out that we really want to receive your questions. As you are listening to the podcast, the Story Podcast on Mondays, the Leadership Podcast on Wednesdays, write us an email. We're getting them. We're reading them. We're often putting a lot of the same types of questions together to ask one question to Pastor Heath. The email is whathappened@fbcjax.com. Please send in those questions as you have them, and we will see you back here on Monday when episode 3 releases of the Story Podcast at What Happened at First Baptist. We'll see you then.